introductory. Our first speaker is resident Daniel Weinfeld, who has done extensive research on African-American contributions to the Civil War, men from Greenburgh and from this area who fought in our Civil War. Daniel, thank you.
Thank you, Judith. I don't know if we have a presentation available. There we go. Okay, great. Members of the Town Council, Town Clerk DeVille, thank you for this opportunity to speak to you tonight on the occasion of African American History Month. My topic is the military service of Greenburgh's African American men in the Civil War. African American men have fought in all the nation's wars. All too often, these volunteers had to overcome obstacles set to impede their service and then face segregation and unequal treatment once they enlisted. Still, these men were determined to defend a nation that did not reciprocate their devotion or adhere to the principles founded in our Constitution and Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Still, this legacy of service and sacrifice is often neglected in our history lessons. Among these forgotten soldiers for liberty are Black men from Greenburgh who fought in the Civil War. In the Civil War, Northern white men served to preserve the Union and gradually came to embrace the cause of abolition. Black New Yorkers, however, according to Dr. Edith Quinn, fought to destroy slavery, to demonstrate their manhood, and to secure their civil rights, especially the right to vote. Have the next slide. Thanks. In New York, a property owning requirement for voting applied only to Blacks, and as intended, disenfranchised most African-American New Yorkers. For example, in 1860, in the town of Greenburgh, only 6 of 48 adult Black men living in the town, 13%, met the property requirement imposed only on Black men as a condition to vote. In November 1860, in the same election, in which Abraham Lincoln won 54% of the vote in New York, New Yorkers decisively rejected a referendum to remove this property requirement for Black voters. This barrier to Black voting in New York would end only with ratification of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution in 1870, 5 years after the end of the Civil War. Next slide. The Civil War started with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861. Black men, however, were allowed to serve as soldiers in the Union Army only late in 1862. Black regiments with white officers formed in several New England states, including the famous 54th Massachusetts, portrayed in the movie Glory. New York State, however, which was slow to enact emancipation earlier in the 1800s, and also slow to enact Black voting in the middle of the century, similarly dragged its feet when it came to organizing Black regiments. This discouraging situation was perhaps worse in Westchester County, which, unlike New York State, voted against Lincoln in 1860, and Greenburgh, where Lincoln received just 1/3 of the vote. Lincoln would lose in both Westchester and Greenburgh again in 1864. New York did not organize its own Black regiments until February 1864, more than a year after they began being organized elsewhere, when the Union League Club in New York City sponsored the 20th and 26th United States Colored Troops Infantry Regiments, 2 of just 3 Black regiments to come from New York State. Next slide. Many Black New Yorkers, including several men from Greenburgh, were undaunted by New York's discouraging their military service. Instead of waiting, these determined volunteers made their way to other states to enlist. I will discuss a few of these Greenburgh soldiers. These photos we are showing are not the specific men we're talking about. I've not been able to find those photos, but I believe these images are representative and informative. Next slide. Joseph Riker was born in Hastings-on-Hudson in 1840 or 1841 to Peter and Mary Ann Riker. Peter passed away in 1853, leaving Mary Ann to raise at least 6 children, including 5 boys. Peter, however, had been one of the few Black property owners in Greenburgh, and Mary Ann was able to keep the family together in their Hastings home for many decades during her long widowhood. Joseph, about 23 years old, did not wait for New York to organize a Black regiment. Sorry. He traveled to Newton, Massachusetts, where he enlisted on January 6, 1864, for 3 years service in Company B of the newly formed 5th Massachusetts Cavalry Regiment, one of the first Black cavalry units in the Union Army. His enlistment papers describe him as a horseman, as his occupation, making the cavalry an obvious choice for him. And here we have a rare photo of a Black Civil War trooper mounted on his horse. Joseph must have made a strong impression on his officers, all of whom were white, as was the practice in the Union Army in the Civil War. He was given the rank of quartermaster sergeant and then very quickly promoted to first sergeant for Company B, the highest rank then available for Black soldiers. Riker's comrades in Company B included Sergeant Charles R. Douglas, the son of Frederick Douglass. Next slide, please. And here is Sergeant Charles Redmond Douglas of the 5th Massachusetts in his cavalry uniform with saber and boots. Joseph Riker was steady and dependable. He never missed a roll call, was never absent on sick leave. He was an ideal soldier and respected as the senior Black non-commissioned officer in Company B. The regiment didn't see much combat, but on April 3rd, 1865, the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry took part in perhaps the most triumphant moment in American history, when they were among the first Union troops to enter and capture Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the slaveholder rebellion. Riker and his comrades will always remember the jubilation of the newly emancipated brethren who cheered the troopers as they rode their horses through the liberated city. The next day, April 4th, the regiment had the privilege of escorting and guarding President Lincoln when he came to tour the fallen city and received a liberator's welcome from the city's Black residents, while whites scowled behind closed doors. As first sergeant of Company B, Joseph Riker would have had a significant role in all these historic events. Joseph returned briefly to Hastings after the war, before heading out west to seek his fortune. He disappeared in Kansas sometime in the 1880s and was never found despite the efforts of his mother to search for her lost son. Next slide. The Fields family were neighbors and also likely close relations to the Rikers. Theodore Fields, a salesman, had married Susan Riker, and they too were property owners in Hastings. The couple had 2 sons, Theodore and David. The younger Theodore was about 18 years old when he joined the United States Navy and served on several ships during the war. Here we see a photo of an unidentified Union sailor. Next slide. And here is the USS Vermont, one of the ships on which we know Theodore was a sailor. After the war, Theodore returned to Hastings to marry and raise his own family, also naming a son, Theodore. His younger brother, David, however, was not so fortunate. The records are a bit murky, but it appears that David Fields was about 17 years old when he left Hastings late in the summer of 1863, went off to Providence to enlist in the 14th Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, one of the earliest Black artillery units. Next slide. Here's a photo of another artilleryman from the same regiment as David served in. The regiment was renamed the 11th United States Colored Heavy Artillery and was sent to serve on the Gulf Coast. Illness killed more soldiers in the Civil War than combat, and David succumbed to illness and died in Texas in May 1864, only about 18 years old. David Fields was not the only Black volunteer from Greenburgh who traveled to Rhode Island to enlist. Next slide. George Washington was born in Maryland around 1830 and quite possibly born into slavery. We can only imagine the challenges he faced in making his way to Greenburgh, where he worked as a laborer before becoming a coachman. He was in his mid-30s, married to Susan, with young daughters Caroline and Frances, when he enlisted in the 14th Rhode Island Heavy Artillery. What were his feelings as he left behind a young family to fight for the liberation of possibly brothers, sisters, and even parents still bound by slavery's chains? George Washington served 2 years with the regiment in Louisiana and Texas and returned to his family in Dobbs Ferry and soon welcomed a 3rd daughter, Laura. Later, the Washingtons moved to Yonkers, where George joined the local post of the Grand Army of the Republic, a National Union Veterans organization, which was often racially integrated. This photo is not the Washingtons, but I think it's a remarkable image of a Civil War soldier with his family. Next slide. Solomon Tierce and William Henry Halstead were 2 men who grew up together in the Black community of the Hills in West Harrison. William Halstead had moved to Greenburgh, where he lived with his wife Rosetta and daughter Hester. Again, this photo are not Solomon Tierce and William Halstead, but as a representative image of two brothers in arms, perhaps actual brothers. Next slide. William Halstead's gravestone in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery may be inscribed U.S. Navy, but we know that he served for 2 years in the 29th Connecticut Infantry. This Black regiment, raised by the state of Connecticut, was a choice of many New York men for enlistment. Next slide. The 29th Infantry, shown here, excelled in combat on the Petersburg Front in 1864 and 1865. And like Joseph Riker's 5th Massachusetts Cavalry, the 29th Connecticut experienced the triumph of marching through the fallen Richmond. After the war, William returned to Rosetta and to Dobbs Ferry. The family had at least 2 more children, Margaret and Frederick, and William worked as a coachman. Solomon Tierce, who worked as a stonemason, traveled with William Halstead to New Haven to enlist in the 29th Connecticut in 1864. During combat in late October 1864, Solomon was struck by a tree limb, severed by cannon fire, and suffered severe internal injuries to his lungs. After 2 months in the hospital, Solomon returned to the regiment. The 29th Connecticut then spent several difficult months in very unhealthful conditions in the Texas coast, where both men were hospitalized for illness. Finally, William Halstead and Solomon Tierce were discharged from the Army together in October 1865. The 1870 census finds Solomon Tierce with his wife Caroline and daughter Jane sharing a house in Dobbs Ferry with the Halstead family. Next slide. The names of both men appear on the Civil War monument in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. William Halstead died in 1881 at the age of just 46, and Solomon Tierce, increasingly incapacitated because of his combat-derived lung injuries, died in 1891 in his late 50s. Next slide. On the side of the Sleepy Hollow monument, Solomon Tierce's name is engraved on this panel. William Halstead's name appears on another one of the 3 panels on the monument. Solomon Tierce's gravestone is also located in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery and is badly in need of repair. Next slide. The military service of Tierce and Halstead is detailed in Dr. Edith Quinn's excellent book, Freedom Journey, which studies the Hills community in the Civil War era. At least one Greenburgh man did serve in New York's 20th USCT regiment that I mentioned before. Next slide. This soldier is not from Greenburgh, but served in the 26th United States Colored Troops, organized by the Union League of New York City in New York at the same time as the 20th United States Colored Troops in February 1864. Alicia Peterson grew up in Queens, but the 1860 census found him living and working in the Irvington home of wealthy banker Alfred Mount. His employer died in July 1864, and Peterson enlisted a few weeks later in the 20th USCT regiment, where he served for 1 year. He returned to Queens after the war, where he married and raised a family. Next slide. And here's a remarkable photo of the entire 26th United States Colored Troops regiment, about 1,000 soldiers, the brother regiment of Alicia Peterson's 20th USCT. These are some of Greenburgh's Black Civil War soldiers that we've identified so far. They include a sailor, artillerymen, a cavalry trooper, and infantrymen too. There are married men with families, young single men, and teenagers. Their service could be the tedium of building fortifications, the novelty and irony of guarding Confederate prisoners, or the peril of combat, which was especially risky for Black Union soldiers, as the Confederate enemy often murdered or enslaved captured Black troops rather than take them prisoner. These men overcame many obstacles in their determination to fight for their rights as citizens in the North and for liberation in the South. Next slide. I'm going to conclude with this photo of a veteran proudly wearing his medals, including the Grand Army of the Republic star-shaped medal. The occasion of African American History Month prompts us to remember these men from Greenburgh and beyond. Their stories remind us of our debt to the Black Civil War soldiers who fought and sacrificed so that our nation, conceived in liberty, would truly become dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was very good.
Really great. Thank you, Dan. That was really good.
Daniel, amazing. Thank you for sharing this information, much of which many residents in the town of Greenburgh, including myself, were unaware of in terms of the contributions that African-American men made to the fight for freedom and representing our town of Greenburgh. Thank you so much.